Hello. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight. My name is Aidan Flax Clark, and I'm the Associate Director for Public Programs at the New York Public Library. And I have the good fortune to welcome you to this conversation with author Laila Lalami. She's here to talk about her remarkable new book, Conditional Citizens on Belonging in America. And she's joined for that conversation by another incredible author, Fatima Bhutto. For those of you not yet familiar with the book, Conditional Citizens asks a deceptively simple question. What does it mean to be American? Who do we consider American? Why do accidents of birth, national origin, race, gender mean that some American citizens enjoy the benefits of citizenship more than others? It's a powerful, transformational, and beautiful read, and I really encourage you to buy it if you haven't already. And of course, I encourage you to buy it from the library shop, which you can do by going to on.nypl.org/shop live. It's also in the email that you received after you signed up for the event. It's in the copy in YouTube, and we'll put it in the chat as well. But if you want to type it, that's on.nypl.org/shop live. Proceeds from your purchase go to benefit the New York Public Library, and if you buy now, you'll get a free commemorative 125th anniversary NYPL tote bag to carry the book around in. Okay, we're going to get to Fatima and Laila in a second. I just want to let you know that because of time differences, this conversation was actually pre-recorded, so we won't be able to take your questions tonight. But we'd love to hear from you. Please say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from, what you're reading, any reactions you have to the discussion. We'd love to hear from you. Also, I just want to plug a couple of other upcoming events. In a couple days, on October 22nd, Coleman Center Fellow Natan Meir will talk about his new book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, which reconsiders the roles played by the outcasts of Jewish society in the shtetls of Eastern Europe, from the dawn of modernity to the eve of the Holocaust. And a few days later, on October 26th, Tamara Payne will speak with the Reverend Calvin O. Butts III about The Dead Are Arising, the posthumously released biography of Malcolm X that her father, Les Payne, spent nearly 30 years working on and is now a finalist for the National Book Award. You can find all of these events and more, plus discover everything that's happening around the library right now by signing up for our newsletter. It's called Connect, and you can find it by going to nypl.org/connect. Okay, so without further ado, let's hear from Laila Lalami and Fatima Bhutto. And again, thank you for watching.
Laila, it's a pleasure to speak to you today, more so after reading Conditional Citizens, your new book. And I wanted to begin something you actually began the book with. You call it a book about love and country. And I thought we could just start there. Will you tell us a little bit more about love and country and what it means, what it requires of us to love a place?
I think that's a great question, a great way to open it. I started thinking about how to approach this book, and whenever I think about the decision to settle here in the United States and to become a citizen, in my mind, it is a decision that is connected to love, only because when I arrived in the United States, I was a foreign student, and my intention had been to complete a graduate degree in linguistics and to return to Morocco, where I hope to work as a college professor. So that was, I had like my plan was sort of pretty clear in my head. And of course, life intervened, and I met somebody while I was in graduate school, an American. We ended up getting married. And so the decision to stay here really in my mind is connected to that. And that's why I think of it as a decision that grew out of love. The other reason that I mention it is because oftentimes when we think about things like patriotism, at least here in the United States, it's something that's very much connected in people's mind to pride and to gratitude and allegiance, all of these feelings, but rarely to dissent or criticism. And to me, I can't, like, if I think about love as a relationship, relationships are built on honesty. And so to me, that meant that that relationship to the country was also needed to be approached with honesty. And so the book kind of grew out of those two sort of impulses, both love, but also critique.
Is this a book that you've been thinking about for a long time? I know that you spoke about the 2016 elections and how it started you on this path, but is it something that was somewhere simmering before that?
Yes, I mean, it's something that I've thought about a great deal over the last 20 years. I've written a lot about the way in which, in particular, Muslim Americans and Arab Americans are perceived and treated in the United States. So it was something that I had been thinking about for a long time. And so, but the inciting incident, the thing that really got me on this consideration of conditional citizens was the 2016 Democratic National Convention, where a couple from Virginia, who were actually originally from Pakistan, came to speak on behalf of the Democratic nominee and eulogized their son, and who had died in Iraq, and praised the country and berated the Republican nominee for his Muslim ban. And in the week that followed, they were just, on the one hand, praised in the liberal media. I remember that the New York Times had a headline saying how Mr. Khan had given a lesson in citizenship to Donald Trump. But at the same time, surrogates of the Republican campaign basically went on the attack. And it just was a very ugly and very dispiriting sort of week. And I ended up writing a column about it called Conditional Citizens for The Nation magazine, where I'm a regular contributor. And it kind of got me thinking about more precisely this dynamic for some citizens in the United States, whereby they are asked to show their allegiance, demonstrate their gratitude through silence or acquiescence. But if there is any kind of dissent, then that citizenship ends up coming into question. And it's a dynamic that the longer I thought about it, the more I saw that it obtained for a number of non-white citizens in the country. Recently, we saw this even with people who were born here, like AOC and others, where they're told to go back to their country because they disagreed with whatever policy position. And so when I started thinking about it more generally outside of that dynamic, which is sort of just this social position of telling people just go back to your country or whatever, but thinking about it as a legal status, that's when I hit upon the idea of connecting it to the experiences of other communities in the US. And so the book grew out of that.
There's so much I want to say to that, but I suppose on the one hand, it's very specific to America, this book, because the specifics you talk about, the narratives, the histories, are unique to America. But it's almost a story of anywhere today, isn't it? When I was reading your book, I thought of India, which is going through this crazy communal moment. I thought of France, I thought of so many places. Were you tempted at all to widen the net of this book?
I was. Unfortunately, that temptation came when I was quite deep into the writing, and I felt that I would have to reconceive the whole thing. But you are 100% right that this is a dynamic that you see in different countries. Citizenship is something that is entirely accidental. Through the lottery of birth, you end up being born in the US or Ghana or Peru or France, anywhere. And that accident of birth ends up determining a great deal about the kind of life that you have, and in particular, the kind of rights that you have access to. So if you're born in, say, for example, North Korea or the Gaza Strip, then you have less freedom of movement than in other countries. If you're born in Saudi Arabia, you don't have freedom of religion. if you're born, and you know, it can go the other way too. If you're born in Finland, you have social rights like the right to free healthcare and the right to free education. So it can go anywhere. And so through a complete accident, a great deal of your life and your access to equality and a life of dignity is determined by that accident. In the US, there is this idea that a lot of Americans are very proud of their citizenship, and you often hear things like, we're the #1 country in the world, the greatest country that has ever existed in the history of the world, which is always a claim that makes me smile because it's so bold. And part of that pride comes from a belief that the Constitution protects everyone equally and grants everyone the same rights. And the reality is that this is just not true. So even within a country like the US, accidents of birth, like race, social class, gender, national origins, also end up determining access to a number of rights, protections, and liberties that otherwise are guaranteed by the Constitution. Just yesterday, I was looking at the newspaper, and there was this news item out of Georgia that was saying how the length of time that a person waits at the polls in Georgia can be predicted by their race. Meaning that if you happen to live in a majority African-American county in Georgia, the time that you wait at the polls is longer than if you are in a majority white county. And so there's nothing really in the laws that is specifically, makes mention of denying people rights because of race, gender, or social class, or any of that. But the way in which laws and regulations are manipulated end up having the same effect as if those things were actually legislated. And there is a historical reason for that in the US. And the reason is that citizenship originally was designed for quote unquote free white persons. And although over the course of the next 200 years, that citizenship was slowly and incrementally and through a great deal of struggle, some of it quite violent and quite bloody, was extended to other groups. It was at each step also followed by new regulations that sought to actually disenfranchise people or take away rights from people. So that is why even in the US, citizenship ends up functioning the same way as it would anywhere else. And you're right that it connects to countries like India or France. I remember when India started on its path of collecting census information about, I believe it was Uttar Pradesh, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was the province where they were collecting all this census information and asking people to provide proof that their parents and grandparents had been Indian citizens. And of course, some people don't have all the paperwork. And after all that census was collected, people really were stripped of citizenship when they couldn't prove it and became essentially immigrants in the country in which they are born, the only country they have ever known. And a huge proportion of those people who were thus denaturalized ended up being Muslims. And so you can see how you can have a law that seems on the surface to be neutral, but in fact is targeted at particular communities. And that kind of approach has very much been used in the US as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, they're doing all kinds of things in Uttar Pradesh, but it was also along the Northeast, where they were doing a national registry, right. And you had to prove citizenship back 3 generations.
Yeah.
Who carries around their great grandmother's birth certificate? No one.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just Muslims, it was also the poor.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you do in your book, which I think is so important, especially at this point, is that you collect all these quite deadly facts and other in a way that reminds us that what we're seeing in America today wasn't born with Trump. Voter suppression didn't begin in 2020. this is a historical legacy in many
Mm-hmm,
ways.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, this disinformation, the manipulation of narratives, finding out that white people are a majority of people who benefit from welfare,
Mm-hmm.
things like that was it's so urgent for us to know now. But it brings me back to something else that you write. You say that when you became a citizen, you took your oath in a fairplex. Is that right?
Yeah, the
Okay.
Pomona Fairplex. Yeah.
The Pomona Fairplex, and that it's used for citizenship ceremonies, but that it used to be an assembly center in the Second World War to keep Japanese Americans
Yeah.
um, who were deemed minority. And you write that even though there's a plaque outside the Fairplex today, you write there's nothing more American than forgetting the past.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, you know, what it is about belonging that requires us some kind of collective forgetting. I mean, there's many levels of forgetting. There's the personal forgetting that you're required to undertake
That's
when
true.
you adopt a new language, or a new, you know, you have to forget certain words and certain accents and certain sounds. And even just now when we're, you know, saying our names so they can be pronounced correctly, you have to drop an accent and things like that. So I was wondering, what was your personal forgetting that was required? And also, what do you feel is the kind of collective forgetting that belonging asks of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really good, it's a really good observation. I think in order to belong, there is a certain amount of erasure that takes place. I think I have been less, it has been required of me a bit less because I am an immigrant. But I think that within generations that follow, that's when the erasure is really full blown, where people are within a generation, you see that languages get lost and a sense of belonging to another country or another culture gets lost or another religion gets lost. I think that there is something about the fashioning of national identity that requires, or that is too often tied to erasure and forgetting. So in building a sense of what it means to be American, there is a sort of a very linear arc of when the country was founded. Here are the myths that go with that founding. It's, you know, it has there are moments of its history that are extremely ugly and violent, but on balance, it is moving forward and there has been progress. And so there is like kind of a story that is very linear. Think of it in a way as if you are writing a short story or you know, or any kind of fiction. You pick and choose what elements you put in order to create sort of a dramatic narrative. And the narrative of a nation involves some of that erasure. And this isn't something that, again, is specific to the US. I mean, certainly in Morocco, it is something that has happened. Like there are moments of history that conveniently get swept under the rug. In India, the same thing. I mean, this is just part of fashioning a national narrative involves some of that erasure. And some of it, I think we have to be very watchful for, because it's that erasure is what causes new forms of unbelonging and new forms of inequality to take place. So for example, with the Pomona Fairplex, I had no idea when I was sworn in that sort of it's a massive complex. It's typically used to host the Los Angeles County Fair. So every summer, children come out there and they pet animals, and there's, you know, you can buy churros, and it's, you know, it's kind of a fun family place. That same place 60 years ago, or 70 years ago, was used as an assembly center for Japanese Americans in Southern California, where their homes, their properties were taken away from them, and they basically were sent there, they were collected there, and from there shipped off to a concentration camp or an internment camp in Wyoming. And it was only through the persistence of Japanese American groups that a plaque was installed. When I was sworn in, that plaque wasn't there, and I had no idea that that was the history of the place. I ended up finding it because I was writing this book and I was trying to find out how large the complex was. And in digging in through the history, I was stunned to discover that that was part of the history of the place. And I frankly was also shocked that the same country that was using that place for collecting and interning and treating people who were born here as traitors to their own country was also being used to swear in new citizens. So it was kind of like a full circle moment. And when I realized that, to me, it was the biggest testament that when you enter into a relationship with a country, which is what citizenship is, there's still that possibility of betrayal along the way. And so in answer to the question, yes, I mean, I do think that erasure is a part of fashioning a national identity. And unfortunately, it is through that erasure that we reenact some of these uglier episodes of US history. So what happened with Japanese Americans with accusations of sedition and so on and so forth has absolutely happened also with Muslim Americans, and might still happen, who knows?
Yeah, and I think maybe this is a good point for people who are joining us and haven't read your book. Tell us briefly, citizen, what makes someone a conditional citizen? And I'd also be interested in hearing how being an Arab woman has complicated that conditionality for you specifically.
Yeah, so in the book, I give a number of definitions for what I think of as conditional citizenship, but at a basic level, it is a conditional citizen is someone whose access to the rights, liberties, and protections of citizenship is curtailed because of accidents of birth, like race, gender, national origins, and social class, and so on. So if you think about citizenship as a relationship rather than a status, but as a relationship between the person and the sort of the sovereign, basically within the social contract, the people that we are electing to serve us and to represent us. If you think about encounters with agents of the state, what happens during those encounters? If you get pulled because of a routine traffic violation, what are the likelihood that that is going to end up with violence or even death? And is that likelihood the same for all citizens? Well, statistics tell us that that's not the case, that if you are African American, you have a much higher likelihood of having that encounter end in violence. If you think about encounters, in the voting booth, just access to the vote, which is the most basic right of citizenship, we also know that because of things like voter ID laws, the closure of polling stations, the fact that incarcerated people or people who are formerly incarcerated are denied the right to vote. All of these things make it so that access to the vote is actually not racially neutral. If you think about what else, things like surveillance by the government, if you're Muslim, you're much more likely to be surveilled by the government. We've seen this with the NYPD spying program. So basically, conditional citizenship is this idea that you're not really an equal citizen, that your rights are curtailed because of accidents of birth. Now, being an Arab woman and an immigrant and a Muslim has placed me in sort of like liminal positions throughout my time in the US. So for example, after 9/11, there was sort of a huge backlash against Muslim Americans here in the US. And not all of it, and I don't mean just, like the spike in hate crimes, which was documented by the FBI, or, nasty comments, which we've all heard in places like workplaces or from neighbors, but also beyond that, actual government actions like special registration for Arab and Muslim men following 9/11, like the NYPD surveillance program and things like that. So actual government actions against these communities. But being a woman, being an Arab and a Muslim woman has kind of put me in this limited position because, for example, I don't cover. So I'm not actually the recipient of some of the nastier comments that people are getting. So you're not visibly Muslim. I'm light skinned. So again, these connection, because the identity of Muslims is very much a racialized identity in the US. So being light skinned in a sense protects you from some of the nastier elements of that backlash. And so that's what I mean when I say that it's liminal, is that it has put me in a position where I can occasionally be on the receiving end of some of that nastiness and discrimination and all of that. But on the other hand, it's also an extremely privileged position, and a position from which to observe all of this and be able to write about it at a distance.
I was asked, not the last time I came to the US, but yeah, I mean, just over a year ago. And I was a college student when 9/11 happened. And, the same thing you get, like, oh, how come you speak English so well? And even if you don't fit the perceived mold of what you're supposed to be, you still get these kind of passive aggressive questions. But the worst thing I ever got was at immigration being asked what I did. And I said, oh, I'm a writer. And normally you get like really cute questions after that, like, oh, a writer, like, what do you write? And this immigration officer, he's holding my Pakistani passport, and I was born in Kabul, and he just looks up and he looks at me and he says, do your books advocate violence?
Yeah.
And I mean, I had just published a novel about radicalism, but I was like, what? How dare you? Of course not. Yeah. But even when you don't cover and you don't look foreign and you don't sound foreign, it's used negatively. There is something sort of special about you because you have escaped these things. And one of the things that I wondered when I was reading your book is you talk about race and you talk about religion and you talk about gender, all these accidents of birth that land people in this space of conditionality. And I wondered why you use the term conditional citizens instead of second-class citizens, because that's, when you're reading about people who are punished more harshly, who end up with more jail time for smaller infractions, who don't have rights, who are surveilled more, it just kept coming back to me that that's ultimately second-class citizenship, isn't it?
It probably is. It was a term that I came up with, as I mentioned, when I was initially thinking through this, with this idea that it is not a secure status, that it's in a sense something that can be put into question and taken away from you. And literally there are also situations in which you can get denaturalized or expatriated. And so that's why I came up with the term. But it doesn't mean that other terms, are not applicable. So certainly, second-class citizenship is also a possible way.
That's in a way it's more terrifying, isn't it? Because second-class status.
I'm sorry, you broke out.
Okay. Oh, sorry, the internet. The terms fit. I suppose you could. They're interchangeable. But to be a second-class citizen is a more terrifying thing, isn't it? Because how do you change your status? How does one move away from being a conditional citizen in a democracy?
Well, I think that the answer to that has to do with the fact that it is I honestly think it's a lifelong struggle. I don't think that we're anywhere near a situation in which that can be resolved. Particularly when you bring in things like social class, and looking at kind of the state of the US today and the grip that special interest capitalist interests have on our political life and on our economy, it really, it's a long struggle to imagine that we're going to get to equal citizenship within my lifetime at any rate. And so I do think of it as a lifelong struggle. It's not something that I think is going to be solved in the next 4 years. And so, yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because I think one of the powerful things about the book was when you describe the period in which you became a citizen, just the year before 9/11, before all the invasions and occupations of the war on terror, you describe that period incredibly clearly, you know, with none of the rosiness that people assume today, you know, where George W. Bush has been resuscitated as this like sweet old man who paints. And you don't allow that.
He gives pieces of candy to Michelle Obama. Everybody thought it was so adorable that he was giving her a piece of candy.
Yeah, how sweet, you know. Yeah. And, you know, talk show hosts have to defend their friendship with him. And you don't allow that. And I think there's no whataboutery in this book. You know, when you talk about how Republican politicians and presidents have failed, you do the same for Democrats. You know, you're very clear about that. And I just wondered if you would briefly tell us about that period, about what it felt like to be a new citizen at that time, for people who maybe don't remember it or who need a reminder of how long this stuff has been in process.
It has been going on for a long time. And I'll just give you a little anecdote actually that will help sort of set this whole idea of forgetting into context. When the current president was elected, in the first year of him being in office, there had been, you know, an airstrike in Syria. And one of my friends was horrified. Oh my God, he's starting a war in Syria. This guy is really dangerous. And I was amazed, because I said, well, we've been at war in Syria long before he came into office. And so the idea that, you know, that history begins with a new administration is something that I think is extremely poisonous and really dangerous. And the reason that I say it's poisonous is I think it actually poisons our chances of progress in this country. This erasure of everything that happened before. The current president did not come out of a vacuum. He is the sort of logical progression of everything that came before him. And unfortunately, because we tend to forget, then everything gets repeated. And so with George W. Bush, for example, his rehabilitation, which I have been watching with increasing dismay, not just him, but other people that were involved in his administration. I've lost count of how many people on social media are retweeting with great approval and great mirth David Frum.
Oh, I know.
And so particularly when David Frum the other day was quite rightly pointing out some voter suppression efforts in Florida. And I just sat there and looked and thought, well, how did your boss come to be in power in 2000, if not for the shenanigans that were happening in Florida in 2000? So he himself is kind of pushing this erasure and this forgetfulness. And I think that is part of the reason why we're not able to have meaningful change, is that people kind of just reset with each election and forget what has happened in the past. And just in the recent past, never mind what has happened, 60 or 70 years ago, but just 20 years ago. And people are really forgetting what George Bush has done. Like just thinking, off the top of my head, the current president made his name on Build the Wall, right? The wall did not start with him. The wall started with Bill Clinton. And when George Bush came into power, he expanded all of that through the Secure Fence Act. When you think about, like I mentioned, Syria, when you think about conflicts in the Middle East, I mean, obviously George Bush has been just a massive bringer of doom to the whole region. I mean, his involvement in Iraq and in Afghanistan, he's really set back the entire region for a generation. And the idea that he's some kind of lovable leader who is civil and therefore deserving of our respect, I find abhorrent. I have no respect for him, and I hope I never do. He's a war criminal, and I think that it's because that is forgotten that people start to say, "Oh, things were different," during Bush. I don't think things were different. I think in some ways things were worse, and in some others maybe they were better for you, but they weren't necessarily better for everyone, right?
Yeah. Well,
so
Milan Kundera
says
that the struggle of people against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting.
Correct.
It's a daily exercise.
Yeah.
That today feels like. I mean, it's always been, but more so.
Yeah, and I think that it's particularly important for people who want to see change to be realistic about that history, and even the more recent history, but just history in general, to be realistic about what different administrations have done. We are not in a situation where one party is absolutely awful and the other party is angelic. We have a neo-fascist party, and we have a party that unfortunately does not behave like an opposition party most of the time. And so it's really, we have to be realistic about that if we're hoping to push them toward any kind of change for all of us.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Democrats had Colin Powell speak at their convention, denied to the United Nations to sell a war. And he had more airtime than anyone. I mean, to have Michael Bloomberg speak at the Democratic convention, but not have a single Muslim voice,
This time around, it wasn't needed.
Yeah. It's tough work though, cataloging all these things.
Right.
And at one point in your book, you described being in Arizona at a book event for one of your earlier publications, and this 60-year-old white woman stands up and asks you to explain ISIS to her. And you say chillingly accurately that any Muslim or Arab in public life, whether they're at a fashion show or at a book event or at a cinema, is going to be asked to explain terrorism.
Right.
And at the view happens to all of us. On the other hand, I would really rather they get an answer from you than from Fareed Zakaria, So I much prefer to be the person asked rather than have David Frum asked about these things. Do you have some sympathy with that, or no, you just don't want to be asked at all?
I mean, it's such a tough question, because on the one hand, it's a question that I resent entirely, and just the idea that I have any special insight into a transnational terrorist group because I happen to be Muslim is deeply offensive. And particularly as I'm not there to talk about ISIS, I was there to talk about a historical novel that was set in the 16th century. So it just is a completely different context. It's not as if we are having a conversation about foreign policy or, the state of world affairs, in which case, it might be something that comes up. It was just a completely different context. On the other hand, part of the reason why I I'm no longer surprised, and I've kind of just accepted that it comes with the territory, is that I've seen it happen to people, pretty much anybody who is Muslim and is in a kind of a public forum. And I've, realizing that it was going to come up and keep coming up. It just depends on the day. If I'm in a good mood, if I'm in a good mood, I might just provide a straight answer. I might basically question why the question is being asked. My answer depends on how I'm feeling that day. The reason that I have never really settled on a very specific and very firm way to approach it is that I also recognize that the media in the United States has not served the interest of the public on this particular issue. There are a number of reporters who are excellent, who do amazing work and literally put their lives on the line to bring us stories that are happening in different countries, and particularly with ISIS. But there is also, unfortunately, a great deal of, how shall I put it? Basically going into a story thinking that you already know what the story is and just filling in the blanks and reporting it that way. So a lot of approaching the story with prejudice, if you will. And we've seen this recently with an extremely popular podcast that the New York Times put out, where the subject of the podcast Caliphate was revealed to be a hoaxer. And when I looked at the number of downloads for that podcast, which is in the tens of millions, all of these people essentially received incorrect information from a source as respected and as serious as the New York Times by one of their star reporters. So when you see that this is something that's happening, and by the way, again, not to be ahistorical, this is a problem that has a history. I can think back to the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and the fake story about Kuwaiti babies in incubators. I don't know if you remember that even. I mean, this is there is a pattern of misreporting on anything having to do with the Middle East, and that misreporting ends up fitting in very neatly into narratives about the need to go to war or just extremely violent policy recommendations. So for example, with this podcast, it came out at a time when Canada was trying to decide whether to repatriate the children of some of its children that had been left behind in Syria. So it really does have an effect on policy decisions, this kind of bad reporting. And when we get that kind of bad reporting into the mainstream, and again, from sources as respected as the New York Times, how can I fault a woman who then asks me a question like that? What this tells me is that she is sensing that the reporting that she's getting is not entirely fair, that there's some part of the story she's missing if she has someone like me standing at a podium that absolutely does not fit the image that she has in her head based on that media. And so that the fact that she can ask that question, then at that point I stopped getting angry. So this is why I say I don't have a particular, definite answer to this. It just depends on my mood, because if I'm thinking about this podcast, then of course I would answer this poor woman. But if I have just read amazing, incredible reporting, by the likes of, I don't know, Rania Abu Zaid in the New Yorker, then I would be like, read a book, open a magazine, educate yourself. So it just depends, it's
there's a great moment in that podcast Caliphate, I think in one of the first episodes, where the reporter describes being at home alone, and there's ominous music, and she's like, ISIS is coming, and the impression is that ISIS is coming to kill her, and it's like the pizza delivery guy or her dog or something. And it was me where I thought, oh, this is all just scary music. ultimately.
Well, it's
Isn't it?
basically destroying the line between reporting and entertainment. It's
Yeah.
this idea that, like it's just the music and all of that. It's making it entertaining or a movie.
Yeah.
And that's very dangerous because it's actually disconnecting this from real life. It's like a big show. And unfortunately, that show has actual, as I said, policy implications.
And not only that, the other thing that I found stunning about that was there's a moment where she comes across all these documents, and because ISIS, of course, loved to keep records. I mean, they had like papers on everything. And she and her fixer translator just start filling bags with the documents, which they're just going to take out of Iraq. And you think, surely this is Iraqi property. Surely this is a matter for the Iraqi government to parse through. Rather than we could talk about caliphate, I think, for hours, but it does bring back something again that you mentioned in your book. You quote Jack Shaheen, who's a critic who found that more than 90% of movies with Arab Muslim characters portrayed them negatively.
Yeah.
And of course, we've seen Homeland, we've seen 24, we know all those things. I've yet to see a Muslim portrayed nicely pretty much anywhere. But it does make you feel as though Muslims are a kind of alien, completely unfamiliar concept to people in America. But you bring up these incredible stories of some of the earliest narratives of enslavement in America coming from men who were captured in Senegal and were Muslims. And they write some of the earliest accounts of enslavement. And you also write about Phyllis Wheaton to publish a collection of poetry, and it's assumed that she too came from a Muslim background. And I'm just curious, how did you always know those stories, or was that something that you unearthed in the process of research?
It was something that I knew about because I had written a historical novel based on a true story of a guy who was enslaved in Morocco in the early 16th century and landed in Florida in 1528. And I actually remember because I came across his story in 2009 and started reading about how he came here and everything. And it just really opened my eyes to the presence of Muslims in the New World. And I had spent 5 years researching that novel. So I kind of knew about that history. When the moment came to write this book, I know you mentioned earlier, you talk about how people view Muslims as completely alien. And alien is the exact word for it, because in fact, one of the nasty emails I got was somebody telling me, are you a Muslim or are you a human being? And you can't be both. So in this person's mind, Muslims are not human beings. So if you're not a human being, that means you're some kind of, I don't know, an alien. So it's, it really is that idea that they are just, that Muslims are, they don't belong in the United States or even in the brotherhood of humanity. And because I had researched that novel, when I was writing that chapter, I decided to include some of that history. And it's an incredible history. And I really do wish that some of it was taught in US schools, because there is, a great deal to learn from it. How many people know that Muslims arrived in the country long before there was a colony at Jamestown? Or how many know that a significant percentage of the enslaved people who were brought to the United States during the transatlantic slave trade were Muslims? And that some of the narratives that they have left us are so precious because they constitute some of the earliest slave narratives that we have. I think that there is a direct line that connects the erasure of these stories, the erasure of these early Muslim stories, to what is happening today. Again, we keep coming back to the idea of fashioning a national identity by leaving out complicating factors or leaving out anything that does not fit into a straight linear narrative. The erasure of Islam and Muslims from the national narrative is precisely what leads us to a situation today where people view Muslims as aliens. And you know, I remember one time I was going, I have so many anecdotes, but like going on job interviews, for example, and getting asked the most incredible offensive questions, and with a face that is completely innocent, looking at you like, oh, you know.
Will you tell us one of them?
Well, there's, you know, this whole idea of, for example, being asked, well, how come you have degrees? You know, is your family, you know, like university degrees, like is,
Yeah.
you know,
Were
did
you the princess of your village?
pretty much. How did your parents allow you to go to school and things like that? And, you know, it's just this idea that the Muslim world, which is this massively complicated part of the world, is reducible to what you have seen in the news, which again makes what you see in the news so important. And that kind of bleeds into an encounter as simple as a job interview, or getting asked about my political views. For example, I remember going on a job interview for a job, I think it was in African literature, and getting asked about my views on Israel, which it's not even, has nothing to do with what the job was, but it's again this idea of like, there's something suspicious just about being an Arab woman or a Muslim woman, and we better find out what her political beliefs are. So there is a direct line that connects that erasure of Muslim history and makes it so that they are simplistically viewed. They're not viewed as complex human beings who may have a range of political views, a range of religious views, but they are just this very simple cliche, entirely derived from what you see in the movies or in the news, without a history attached to it.
You said a second ago that you wish some of these stories were taught in schools or in universities, and I'm just listening to you now. I'm just wondering, because I always want to know these things. What are some of the works that you wish were taught? I mean, that people listening today might be able to go and find and look up and I say this with my pen at the ready. What do you think is missing? You know, we hear a lot about decolonizing syllabus and decolonizing education. What are a couple of things you think are essential to that process?
Well, I mean, I do think, for example, studying the arrival of Muslims in America. So, for example, this guy, the guy that I wrote a book about, it's called The Moorish Account. If anybody wants to include it in their syllabi, by all means, do that. But there are a number of a number of scholarly sources on him. There's the Library of Congress has holdings on Omar ibn Said, who is one of the authors of the narratives. In fact, they have all of that information there. There's a great history of Islam by the scholar Kambiz Kani Abasari. Putting Edward Said on the curriculum, you know, there's just like all kinds of people that can be added, and some of them are included in the source notes of the book. I think what's really just missing is just even in the textbooks, this mention that the enslaved people who came to this country came from different parts of Africa, and they came with from different cultural and religious backgrounds, rather than saying that these people came and then once they're here, they're treated as though they are just all of the same, you know, from the same, I don't know, part of the world, and they are all Christianized, because obviously they were forcibly Christianized here. But it's just not something that even enters into discussions of slavery. If anything, we see the opposite in textbooks, many of which are printed in the great state of Texas. And you know, I mean, there are, like, I remember that there was this one textbook that mentioned enslaved people as workers. It's just, so if anything, we're going in the opposite direction where there's an erasure of that history, even at a very basic factual level. So.
Yeah. I've got two last questions before we have to wrap up. The first one is sort of connected, which is, I'm always curious what writers are reading for pleasure rather than for work. I know not to ask what writers are working on.
That's good.
But yeah, what are you reading that you love?
I cannot recommend my habit, which is that even though we are living in extremely dystopian times, I am still reading things that are semi dystopian. So right now I'm reading a massive book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. And it I'm already constantly complaining about surveillance, but it's a magisterial work, and it really makes the case for how even things like our free will, or what we think of as our ability to make decisions based on our own preferences and ethical views of the world, is being threatened by these algorithms that are constantly monetizing their predictions of our behavior. So it's an incredible, incredible book. Let's see what else. Before that, I had just finished reading Homeland, Elegies by Ayad Akhtar, which is a book that starts actually in the Trump era. The narrator's father is a Trump supporter, and it kind of goes back 20 years before that into sort of the family history. And before that, I'm trying to think. I think I read, oh goodness, I read something that was really good just before that. Oh, I read Claudia Rankine's new book, which is called Just Us, and looks at experiences of race and racism in the United States. And I had read it as like an online galley, but I ended up getting it as a hardcover. It is a beautiful, beautiful artifact because she mixes photographs and charts. I mean, it's just an incredible, just like as an object, it's kind of an incredible book to have. Just a really excellent book. And I'm trying to think. I always blank on these questions, right? So
no one ever remembers what they're reading.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
Well, my last question is that you write in the book that while despair is seductive, you call it a gift to the status quo. And so I'm not going to end by asking you our collective despair, but I am curious how you stave it off yourself. These grim times.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Wait, hang on. I'm going to repeat the question because it got cut with my lousy internet. Hold on. Got it. Okay, so Laila, for the last question, you write that while despair is seductive, you call it a gift to the status quo. And I won't ask you for a remedy for our universal collective despair in these grim times, but how do you deal with despair? How do you stave it off?
I think for me, just being able to get up in the morning and go about my day, I need to feel like I'm taking that I'm taking action, even if it's in a small way, but like every day doing something that makes me feel like I've staved it off. I think that despair is precisely what people who are very much invested in maintaining conditional citizenship are counting on. They are counting on people not being involved in something as simple as the electoral process, but even beyond that, apathy helps that. So for me, it can be, for example, I spent the last few weeks writing postcards to voters. I've never written more postcards in my life. But, you know, and now as we approach the election, moving more towards text banking. But beyond electoral efforts, just maintaining a certain level of participation in civic life. So, and it can be something as simple as volunteering my time in schools to help people who are in my child's school, to help people who don't actually have a parent at home and can't get the one-on-one tutoring that they need, or donating to mutual funds, or donating to food banks. Right now, the statistics in the US are really, really, really staggering in terms of hunger and homelessness. So basically anything that we can do to help people in our communities and beyond is something that I do. But just something small every day. Like every day I ask myself, what can I do today? And I think that grows out of my practice as a writer, because, as a writer, you kind of have to write every day and establish a routine so that at the end of the year, you have a manuscript. And so I think, I think of this in the same way. What can you do every day that can help move that needle just a little bit?
Thank you, Laila. Thank you for this conversation and for Conditional Citizens, which I'm sure people can buy by touching some link being here. The New York Public Library can assist. Thank you so much for all your work, Laila.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Fatima.
Pleasure.
Black text on white background. New York Public Library lion logo, 125 years. Learn more about the New York Public Library, nypl.org.